Ladies and gentlemen, grab your triple patty cheeseburgers, put on your aviator sunglasses, and prepare for a dose of pure, unadulterated freedom. We are about to tell the story of the greatest startup in the history of the human race. A project that started with a bunch of religious outcasts freezing in a swamp and ended with a flag on the moon and the ability to order a pizza via a satellite in space. This is the story of the United States of America. But before we get to the fighter jets and the internet, we have to rewind. Way back. Imagine the world map in the 1600s. Europe is like that old, grumpy homeowners association. You've got kings, queens, dukes, and earls, and everyone is obsessed with tea-wigs and marrying their cousins to keep the bloodline pure. It was a crowded, dusty continent where your destiny was decided the moment you were born. If your dad was a peasant, congratulations, you're a peasant. Have fun shoveling mud for the rest of your life. But then there was a rumor of a new world, a place so wild, so vast, and so untamed that it scared the powdered wigs off the aristocrats. But for the dreamers, the desperate, and the crazy, it looked like opportunity. Now let's get one thing straight. The start wasn't pretty. The first English attempt at a startup in Jamestown, Virginia was, well, let's call it a learning experience. They picked a swamp. The water was salty. The mosquitoes were the size of small birds. And the locals, the Powhatan Confederacy, they were looking at these pale, sweaty guys in wool coats, dying of heat stroke, and thinking, these guys aren't going to make it to winter. And they almost didn't. There was starvation, there was disease, and there was a guy named John Smith who had to basically scream, if you don't work, you don't eat to keep everyone alive. It was the ultimate survival reality show, but the loser didn't get voted off the island. They just died of dysentery. But here is where the American spirit was born. In Europe, if you failed, you were done. In America, if you survived, you got stronger. More people came. The Puritans landed in the North. Now, these guys weren't exactly party animals. They outlawed Christmas and fun. But man, could they work. They looked at a frozen forest and saw a shipbuilding empire. They looked at a rocky coast and saw a trade hub. By the mid-1700s, there were 13 colonies. And something strange was happening. These people didn't feel like British subjects anymore. They were eating corn, hunting deer, fighting bears, and building log cabins. They were becoming something new. Meanwhile, back in London, King George III was sitting on his throne, adjusting his fancy stockings and looking at his credit card bill. Britain had just fought a massive war with France to protect the colonies, and the king was broke. So he had a brilliant idea. Hey, he thought, why don't we make the Americans pay for it? Enter the taxes. Sugar tax, stamp tax, tea tax. Now, if there is one thing you do not do to an American, even a proto-American, it is touch their wallet without asking. The colonists weren't just mad about the money. They were mad about the principle. No taxation without representation, they shouted. It was the 18th century equivalent of, you're not the boss of me. The tension built up until one cold night in Boston. A bunch of colonists feeling particularly rowdy dressed up poorly as Mohawk warriors boarded British ships and yeeted 342 chests of tea into the harbor. This wasn't just vandalism, it was a statement. It was the most expensive cup of tea in history, brewed in the cold, salty Atlantic. King George was not amused. He sent the Redcoats, the British Army, the finest, most disciplined fighting force on the planet. They had shiny uniforms, muskets that worked most of the time, and a navy that owned the oceans. The Americans, they had pitchforks, squirrel rifles, and a lot of attitude. The betting odds were 1,000 to 1 against the colonies. It should have been a slaughter. But the British made a classic mistake. They underestimated the underdog. Enter George Washington. The man, the myth, the guy on the $1 bill. He wasn't a tactical genius like Napoleon. He lost more battles than he won. But Washington had a superpower: he wouldn't quit. He was the master of the tactical retreat. He realized that to win, he didn't need to destroy the British army. He just needed to keep the American army alive long enough for the British to get tired of paying for the war. It was the ultimate war of attrition. The Continental Army froze their toes off at Valley Forge, eating shoe leather soup, but they stayed. Why? Because for the first time in history, they weren't fighting for a king. They were fighting for an idea. And then the plot twist. France, who hated Britain more than they loved baguettes, decided to swipe right on America. You guys want to embarrass the British? Here's some money, some guns, and some boats. Have fun. With French help, Washington trapped the British at Yorktown. When the British surrendered, their band played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." And it really was. A bunch of farmers had just beaten the empire, but winning the war was the easy part. Now they had to run a country. And let me tell you, the first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, was a disaster. It was like trying to run a group project, where everyone has veto power. Nothing got done. So the Founding Fathers met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. It was hot, it smelled like sweaty wool and old parchment. But in that room, they wrote the source code for the modern world, the Constitution. They came up with something radical: separation of powers, checks and balances. The idea that the president works for the people, not the other way around. Was it perfect? Madre. It had massive, tragic flaws specifically regarding slavery and who actually counted as the people. But it was a start. It was a mechanism that allowed for updates, amendments. It was a living document. Fast forward a bit. America is free, but it's small. It stops at the Mississippi River. Enter Thomas Jefferson. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte of France was short on cash fighting. Everyone in Europe is expensive. He offered to sell the Louisiana Territory, a chunk of land that doubled the size of the U.S. overnight, for $15 million. That is about 3 cents an acre. It was the greatest real estate deal in history. Jefferson didn't even check with Congress. He just whipped out the national checkbook and said, "Sold." Suddenly America was huge. But what was out there, no one knew. So Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark on the ultimate road trip. 2 guys, a dog, and a Native American woman named Sacagawea, who carried the entire team on her back because the guys kept getting lost. They went all the way to the Pacific Ocean, seeing buffalo grizzlies and landscapes that looked like another planet. They came back with stories that ignited a fever in the American soul, the frontier spirit. This launched the era of manifest destiny. Now, looking back, this is a complicated topic. For the settlers, it was a divine calling to spread democracy west. For the Native Americans, it was an apocalypse. We have to acknowledge that. The expansion of the U.S. came at a terrible cost to the indigenous people. But from the perspective of the nation's growth, it was explosive. Americans packed their lives into covered wagons, essentially wooden RVs with no shocks, and headed west. They crossed deserts, climbed the Rockies, and fought dysentery on the Oregon Trail. Then, in 1848, someone found a shiny rock in California. Gold. The world lost its mind. People from all over the planet, China, Europe, South America, rushed to San Francisco. It was chaos. It was the Wild West. Towns popped up overnight. If you had a shovel and a dream, you could be a millionaire. Or you could go broke and get shot over a poker game. But this rush filled the map. America was now a continental nation stretching from sea to shining sea. But there was a crack in the foundation. A massive, ugly crack that had been there since the beginning slavery. The South's economy was built on it. The North was moving towards industrialization and abolition. You cannot have a country based on liberty and justice for all, while millions of people are in chains. It was a hypocritical bug in the system that had to be fixed. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected. He was a tall, gangly lawyer from Illinois who kept his important papers in his stovepipe hat. The South saw him and said, "Nope, we're out." They seceded. The Civil War began. This wasn't just a war. It was a family brawl. Brother against brother. It was the bloodiest conflict in American history. But it was also the moment America grew up. Lincoln didn't just fight to preserve the map. He fought to redefine the soul of the nation. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He turned the war into a crusade for human freedom. The North had the factories, the railroads, and the telegraph. The South had better generals early on. But you can't fight a supply chain with cotton. When the dust settled in 1865, 600,000 men were dead. Lincoln was assassinated, a tragic ending for the nation's greatest captain. But the Union held. The slaves were free, though the road to true equality was still miles long. America had looked into the abyss, fought its demons, and survived. We were battered, we were bruised, but we were one nation indivisible. And then came the steroids. The post-Civil War era was like America chugged 5 energy drinks and hit the gym. We entered the Industrial Revolution. This is the era of the Titans. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan. These guys had mustaches you could hide a bird in, and bank accounts that could buy small countries. They built the railroads that connected the coasts. They turned iron into steel to build skyscrapers that pierced the clouds. They drilled for oil to power the world. It was the age of invention. In a lab in New Jersey, a wizard named Thomas Edison was inventing, well, everything. The light bulb, the phonograph, the movie camera. He literally turned night into day. Down the street, Nikola Tesla was playing with lightning. In Ohio, 2 bicycle mechanics named Orville and Wilbur Wright looked at birds and thought, "We can do that." Everyone told them they were crazy. If God wanted man to fly, he'd have given us wings. But Americans don't listen to haters. In 1903, at Kitty Hawk, they flew. It was only for 12 seconds, but it changed everything. We had conquered the land, and now we were conquering the sky. By the early 1900s, America was the richest country on earth, but we were still kind of the new kid at the pool table. Europe was still acting like the boss. Then Europe decided to commit suicide. World War I. At first America was like, "Nah, we're good over here. You guys have fun in your trenches." We tried to stay out of it. We sold stuff to everyone. But eventually, German submarines started sinking American ships, and they sent a telegram to Mexico saying, "Hey, attack the US and we'll give you Texas back." That was the last straw. Woodrow Wilson rolled up his sleeves and said, "All right, boys, let's go make the world safe for democracy." The American doughboys arrived in France. They weren't battle-hardened like the British or French, but they were fresh, well-fed, and carried shotguns into the trenches, which the Germans actually complained was unfair. We helped tip the scales, won the war, and then we went home. We basically mic dropped and went back to partying. And party we did. The roaring 20s, jazz flappers, Ford Model Ts, cheap credit, and the stock market going up, up, up. It was the Great Gatsby era. Everyone was getting rich. Nothing could go wrong. Spoiler alert. It went wrong. The stock market crashed harder than a dubstep beat drop. The Great Depression. Banks failed. Factories closed. People who were buying champagne yesterday were standing in soup lines today. It was a dark time. But remember that American grit. It didn't vanish. Franklin D. Roosevelt got on the radio and told everyone, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He launched the New Deal. He built dams, bridges, roads. He put America to work. But what really ended the Depression wasn't policy. It was another villain. Over in Europe, a failed painter with a bad mustache named Hitler was causing trouble. And in the Pacific, the Empire of Japan was expanding. America tried to play isolationist again. "Not our problem. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. It was a devastating blow. Battleships sank. Thousands died. Japan thought they had knocked America out of the fight, but in reality, they had just poked a sleeping T-Rex in the eye. The reaction was instant. The entire U.S. economy turned on a dime. Car factories stopped making cars and started making tanks. Toaster factories started making machine gun parts. We built ships faster than the enemy could sink them. We built planes by the hour. Women flooded into the factories. Rosie the Riveter became the icon of the era, proving they could weld and rivet just as well as the guys. We fought 2 wars at once. In the Pacific, the Marines island hopped through jungles facing an enemy that would rather die than surrender. In Europe, we teamed up with the British and the Soviets. Then came D-Day. June 6, 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in history. Thousands of young Americans stormed the beaches of Normandy, running into a wall of machine gun fire to liberate a continent they had never seen. It was the ultimate act of sacrifice. We pushed Hitler back to Berlin. We liberated the concentration camps and showed the world the horror of the Holocaust. And in the Pacific, to end the war without a costly invasion of Japan, America unleashed the secret weapon of the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. It was a terrifying display of power that changed the world forever. The war ended. The U.S. and the Soviet Union were the only 2 left standing. And thus began the Cold War. It was a staring contest with nuclear weapons. The U.S. versus the USSR, capitalism versus communism, Rocky Balboa versus Ivan Drago. But this wasn't just about bombs. It was a competition of systems. Who could build the better life? The U.S. experienced the biggest economic boom in history. The suburbs, the interstate highway system. Everyone had a car, a TV, and a refrigerator. We invented rock and roll. Elvis shook his hips and terrified parents everywhere. We invented the teenager as a concept. Then the Soviets played a dirty trick. They launched Sputnik, a beeping metal ball in space. America panicked. Are they watching us? Are they going to drop space lasers on our heads? NASA was formed. The space race was on. President JFK, looking handsome and tanned, stood up and said, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard." And we did it. 1969, Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong took that small step. Think about the audacity of that. Less than 70 years after the Wright brothers barely lifted off the ground, Americans were playing golf on the moon. It was the ultimate flex. The whole world watched on grainy TVs, and for a moment, humanity was united in awe. And yeah, we planted the flag. Sorry, aliens, the moon is American property now. Kidding. Mostly. But the Cold War wasn't just won in space. It was won in the grocery store and the movie theater. While people in the Soviet bloc were waiting in line for bread, Americans were choosing between 50 types of cereal. We exported our culture. Blue jeans, Coca-Cola, Hollywood movies, jazz, Michael Jackson. The world wanted to be like us. We didn't just conquer territory, we conquered the cool. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it wasn't destroyed by tanks. It was destroyed by people who wanted freedom, who wanted the life they saw on Western TV. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War was over. America was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. The 90s were a victory lap. The internet boom began. A couple of nerds in garages in Silicon Valley, Bill Gates. Steve Jobs changed the world again. We connected the entire planet. Information became free. The economy soared. We were the sole superpower, the global policeman. Of course, being the top dog isn't easy. The 21st century threw some curveballs. 9/11 was a punch to the gut, a tragic reminder that the world is still dangerous. We got bogged down in wars in the Middle East. We had financial crashes. We argue with each other constantly on Twitter. Politics has become a spectator sport. But look at the big picture. Look how far we've come. We started as a ragged group of colonists, terrified of the dark. Now we are a nation of 330 million people from every corner of the globe. We are a melting pot, an experiment to see if people of different races, religions, and backgrounds can live together under one flag. And you know what? Despite the noise, despite the news, telling you everything is terrible, it works. We are the country that invented the airplane, the internet, the light bulb, jazz hip-hop, and the double bacon cheeseburger. We are the country where an immigrant can arrive with $5 in their pocket and found a Fortune 500 company. We are loud, we are chaotic, we make mistakes, and we are sometimes a little too confident for our own good. But we are also generous, innovative, and resilient. When the world needs help, who do they call? When there's a disaster, who sends the aircraft carriers with food and water? When there's a tyrant who stands in the way? Yeah, we get flack for meddling. But imagine a world without the American shield. It's a lot darker. So how did America become so big and powerful? It wasn't just the land, or the guns, or the money. It was the software, the operating system of liberty, the belief that you have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The belief that you can fail, get up, dust yourself off, and try again. That is the American dream. It's not a guarantee, it's an opportunity. From the frozen winters of Jamestown to the heat of the Middle East, from the cotton fields to the launch pads of Cape Canaveral, the American story is an adventure. It's a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. It's the story of a nation that is constantly under construction, constantly trying to form a more perfect union. We aren't done yet. The script is still being written. We've got Mars to colonize, diseases to cure, and new technologies to invent that we can't even imagine yet. So to the rest of the world, thanks for watching. And to my fellow Americans, keep dreaming, keep building, and for the love of George Washington, keep being a little bit crazy. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who usually do.